picture this scene vividly. 12 young men are forced onto their knees in the cold dirt, their hands cruelly bound behind their backs. They are not hardened soldiers. They are the terrified sons of the Trojan elite. Towering over them is Achilles. He offers no grand speech, no justification. He doesn't hesitate. He simply grabs the first boy by the hair, yanks his head back, and executes him with a swift slash of his bronze sword. The twitching body is then brutally dragged to a massive pyre and flung onto the churning flames. He turns immediately for the second boy, then the third, methodically slaughtering all 12 of them like sacrificial cattle, seeking a violent outlet for his consuming grief. This is not the shining, golden hero celebrated in modern cinema. This is a cold-blooded war criminal, actively committing an act of human sacrifice. This is the unvarnished, brutal truth of Achilles. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of ancient suffering and survival, if you appreciate learning about the hidden, darker truths lurking beneath historical myth, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content. And I genuinely enjoy seeing your engagement, so please comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from. It truly is incredible to think that we are exploring these ancient narratives together from different continents, connected across millennia by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, let's examine the profound meaning of the blood on his hands. Homer deliberately included this horrifying massacre in the Iliad for a critical reason. He wanted to show us that Achilles had fundamentally ceased to operate as a human being. To the ancient Greeks, mistreating a corpse or performing human sacrifice was not just a crime, but a deep religious taboo, a severe pollution of the soul. But Achilles was beyond morality. At this point in the war, he operated outside the codified laws of both men and gods. In fact, the epic poem itself begins with a powerful, specific warning. The very first word of the Iliad is menes. While often translated softly as rage, that English word fails to capture its true scope. Menes is a cosmic wrath, a devastating force usually reserved only for divine entities like Zeus or Apollo. When a mere human harnesses this level of fury, civilization doesn't bend, it cracks wide open. The entire narrative of Achilles is simply the detailed documentation of that crack spreading until it inevitably shatters everything in its path. For 9 long years, the combined Greek army, the Achaeans, had slowly rotted on the muddy beaches outside Troy. They were less a unified force and more a loose collective of pirate kings, primarily raiding the surrounding coastline for plunder, gold, and captive women. Disease swept relentlessly through the crowded camp, and morale collapsed into squalor. In the heart of this chaos, Achilles functioned as the ultimate, indispensable weapon. He didn't merely engage in combat, he systematically exterminated the enemy. He personally commanded the Myrmidons, a disciplined shock troop unit that moved with unmatched speed and struck with a ferocity unlike any other phalanx. But the man who butchered boys at the funeral pyre was not born a monster. He was meticulously made into one. We must immediately shatter the widely accepted popular myth right now. You know the tale. His mother dipped him into the river Styx, holding him by the heel, rendering him invulnerable everywhere else. That comforting story is actually a late Roman invention, added centuries after the fact to make the legend more palatable for children. The original, foundational Greek myths tell a vastly darker version of his origin story. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, did not use water to grant him power. She used fire. Thetis deeply despised the inescapable mortality she sensed lurking within her infant son. She saw his human flesh as a profound defect. So, every night, she performed a terrifying ritual. She buried the baby Achilles in the red-hot embers of the palace hearth. She allowed the fire to consume his skin, attempting to purge the inherent human weakness out of him, and replace it with divine, supernatural endurance. She was quite literally forging a child, much like a blacksmith forges a sword in the flames. His horrified father, Peleus, walked in on this ritual one night. He saw his wife roasting their screaming son in the intense heat of the fireplace, and frantically snatched the boy away. But the psychological damage was done. From infancy, Achilles learned a terrible lesson, that love looked like violence. He learned that to be special, to be worthy, you had to endure the burning. This was not a childhood, it was an assembly line designed to produce a killer. To complete the process of dehumanization, his father sent him away into the untamed wild. He didn't attend a prestigious academy. He went to Mount Pelion to live under the care of Chiron the centaur. Forget the wise, gentle teacher figure you might expect. Chiron fed the boy a strict, barbaric diet, the raw intestines of lions and the marrow of wild boars. Ancient logic followed the brutal rules of sympathetic magic, the belief that you become what you consume. By eating the raw organs of apex predators, Achilles methodically absorbed their inherent aggression. He absorbed their absolute lack of mercy. He grew up sleeping exposed on hard ground, hunting bears on foot, and viewing empathy as a debilitating liability. By the time the Trojan War began, the Greeks had not recruited a hero. They had activated a precision weapon of mass destruction. He possessed the physical prowess of a god but the emotional maturity of a stunted child, driven entirely by a desperate, consuming need for Klaus, eternal, unfading glory. He knew the prophecy perfectly: go to Troy and die famous, or stay home and die forgotten. He chose the blood. But as we watch him coldly toss those 12 terrified Trojan boys onto the fire, we see the true, horrifying reality of that choice. He didn't merely sacrifice his life for glory, he sacrificed his essential humanity. And the worst was yet to come. To truly understand the sheer terror Achilles inspired on the field, we must closely examine the tools of his trade. Forget the gleaming, silver-plated steel and intricate armor you see in Hollywood blockbusters. The Trojan War was fought squarely in the late Bronze Age. This was a world defined by soft metal. When two armies collided around 1200 BC, the sound was duller, heavier, a resonant thud rather than a ringing clang. Bronze, being an alloy of copper and tin, bends easily. It dents. It required constant straightening and repair after every minor skirmish. A sword's strike didn't just cut, it violently bludgeoned. The armor of the period, like the famous Dendra panoply recovered by archaeologists, was not a fitted suit of medieval plate. It was a clumsy, lobster-like casing of heavy bronze sheets that severely restricted movement and essentially cooked the man inside. But Achilles moved through this world differently. The Iliad describes his personal gear with an obsessive level of detail, immediately distinguishing him from the clumsy conscripts around him. His lethal effectiveness began and ended with his spear. In the original Greek text, it is specifically named the Pelion ash. This was not a standard-issue pike. It was a massive, irreplaceable shaft of dense ashwood cut from the very summit of Mount Pelion, the same wild peak where he had consumed lion intestines. And Homer makes a specific point to describe the physics of this weapon. It was so heavy, so incredibly dense, that no other Achaean hero could even lift it. Not the powerful Agamemnon, not the giant Ajax, not even the clever Odysseus. Only Achilles could wield it. Think for a moment about the mechanical superiority of that weapon. In a duel, while other men were jabbing with light willowwood spears that might snap harmlessly against a shield, Achilles was thrusting a heavy beam of timber tipped with bronze. When that mass hits a shield, it doesn't just pierce the metal, it shatters the arm and shoulder holding it. He wasn't fencing. He was battering his opponents into bloody submission with overwhelming kinetic energy. Then there were his soldiers. A general is only ever as formidable as his vanguard, and Achilles commanded the dreaded Myrmidons. Mythology claims these men were originally ants transformed into humans by Zeus to repopulate an island. While that is a convenient fairy tale, the truth about their tactical behavior is far more unnerving. The Ant-Man metaphor perfectly describes their discipline. In an era of disorganized tribal warfare, where battles were frequently chaotic, shapeless brawls, the Myrmidons fought with a ruthless, hive-mind discipline. They were elite shock troops hailing from the rugged region of Phthia. They never broke rank, they swarmed. While other Greek kings like Menelaus commanded loose levies of farmers and fishermen who primarily longed to return home, Achilles led a professional private army, the Bronze Age equivalent of a specialized counter-terror unit, or Navy SEALs. They moved in silence, following their commander's rhythm precisely. When Achilles charged, the Myrmidons surged like a terrifying black tide behind him, creating an overwhelming force multiplier that could break any Trojan line instantly. We must also acknowledge their chilling visual appearance. It wasn't just the shining bronze. The archaeological record gives us a detail far more terrifying than reflective metal. Many warriors of this specific era, including Odysseus and the Myrmidons, wore helmets constructed entirely from boar tusks. To create a single helm, a hunter would have had to kill 40 or 50 wild boars. Consider the powerful visual signal that sends across a dusty battlefield. When you stared across the field at a charging phalanx of Myrmidons, you were not looking at shiny, decorative crests. You were looking at thousands of dead animal teeth, rows upon rows of ivory trophies harvested from the most dangerous beasts, painstakingly stitched onto leather caps. It screamed that these men were apex predators. Achilles led this pack of wolves. He didn't fight for patriotism. He certainly didn't fight for Helen. He fought because violence and plunder were the only economies he truly understood. Before the siege of Troy settled into the 10-year stalemate we recognize, Achilles systematically decimated the surrounding region. He famously sacked 12 coastal cities and 11 inland towns. He turned the war into a highly profitable business venture. He relentlessly raided livestock, burned villages to the ground, and sold the women he captured into slavery. This was the dark reality of the hero's life, piracy on a grand, state-sanctioned scale. This relentless raiding built his fearsome legend, but it was also sowing the critical seeds of his destruction. He wasn't merely accumulating gold, he was accumulating time. In ancient Greek warrior culture, time meant honor, but it was physical and tangible. You measured a man's honor by the size of the pile of loot in his tent and the number of captive women in his bed. If you took away the loot, you didn't just steal his property, you erased his honor. You fundamentally castrated him socially. This context is absolutely critical for understanding the catastrophic events that follow. Achilles is a man psychologically conditioned to kill, armed with a spear no one else can lift, leading a death squad of ant-men, and operating entirely on a currency of violent plunder. He is a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark would not come from a Trojan sword. It would come from his own commander-in-chief, over the one thing Achilles valued more than blood, his prize. Before the Myrmidons, before the towering pile of loot, and before earning the title best of the Achaeans, the world's greatest killer briefly tried to be a ghost. There is a bizarre, often glossed over chapter in Trojan war history that doesn't fit the hypermasculine image of the hero. Just months before the great fleet launched, Achilles wasn't sharpening his spear. He was wearing a dress, hiding in a harem on the island of Scyros. His mother Thetis, terrified by the prophecy that her son would surely die at Troy, smuggled him into the court of King Lycomedes. She meticulously disguised him as a girl, gave him the name Pyrrha, and hid him among the king's daughters. Imagine the suffocating psychological tension of this scene. You have a young man raised on raw lion intestines and marrow, a boy who has been physically conditioned to shatter bones, now forced to sit still in silk robes, weaving wool and making polite, feminine conversation. He was a wolf trying desperately to pass as a sheep. It was an impossible acting job. The Greek kings, knowing they couldn't possibly take Troy without his destructive power, dispatched their master manipulator, Odysseus, to hunt him down. Odysseus knew he couldn't simply knock on the door and ask for Achilles. He needed a trap. He needed to trigger the boy's primal instinct. Odysseus arrived at the palace posing as a merchant, and he laid out his wares in the great hall for the king's daughters to inspect. On one side of the display table, he spread out expensive jewelry, exotic perfumes, and fine textiles, the expected desires of royal women. On the other side, hidden slightly beneath the fabrics, he placed a few items of high-quality weaponry, a sturdy, embossed shield and a razor-sharp spear. The real princesses flocked immediately to the jewelry. They held up the necklaces, laughing and admiring the gold. But one girl stood pointedly apart. The disguised Achilles drifted inexorably toward the steel. His hands didn't reach for the perfume bottle. They hovered, trembling, over the grip of the sword. His body language betrayed him utterly. The muscle memory of the warrior was screaming to be released. Odysseus seized the moment. He subtly signaled his men waiting outside. They blew a war trumpet, a sudden, deafening blast that signaled an immediate, full-scale attack. Panic erupted in the hall. The real princesses screamed and fled hysterically for cover. But Pirad did not run away. He stripped off his feminine disguise in a heartbeat, seized the shield and spear from the table, and immediately scanned the room for enemies, ready to kill. The mask had fallen. The predator revealed himself. Odysseus grabbed his arm and smiled. The draft dodging was over. This singular moment is crucial because it crystallizes the essential tragedy of Achilles. He had a literal way out. He was safe on Scyros. He could have chosen the long life half of the prophecy. He could have married, raised children, and died an old, anonymous man in a warm bed. But the instant the trumpet sounded, his own nature made the irrevocable choice for him. He was biologically incapable of cowardice. He boarded the ship with Odysseus, knowing exactly what it meant. He was not sailing to a victory parade. He was sailing directly to his own funeral. Once they landed at Troy, the clock started ticking. For 9 years, he desperately suppressed the knowledge of his impending death by burying himself in the violence we discussed earlier. He became the sacker of cities, the sole engine of the Greek war effort. But the internal tension between his mortal fate and his divine rage was building relentlessly. He was doing all the critical work, taking all the massive risks, and winning the war for Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae. Agamemnon, in contrast, was a bureaucrat, a commander who led from the far back yet claimed the lion's share of the glory. This dynamic, the burning resentment between the talent in the field and the management in the tent, is absolutely timeless. It happens in modern corporations, and it shattered the unity of the Bronze Age Achaean army. And it brings us directly to the inciting incident of the Iliad. The spark wasn't strategy or territory. It was a woman named Briseis. But do not mistake this conflict for a romance novel. In the context of the ancient world, Briseis was not a girlfriend or a lover. She was a trophy. She was a living medal of honor, officially awarded to Achilles by the army itself. She was the physical, walking proof of his time. When Agamemnon, in a fit of petty, crippling insecurity, decided to seize Briseis for himself, he didn't just break a heart. He violently broke the social contract of the entire army. He told Achilles, in effect, "Your value is 0. Your achievements are mine to appropriate." For a man who had chosen a swift death over a long life just to be eternally remembered, this was the ultimate, soul-crushing insult. The beast that Odysseus had so cleverly unleashed on Scyros was about to turn its teeth away from the Trojans and snap violently at its own masters. When Achilles stopped fighting, the war didn't just stall, it violently reversed. Without the Myrmidons anchoring the line, the Achaean formation instantly lost its spine. The Trojans, who had spent years cowering behind their massive walls whenever Achilles was on the field, suddenly realized the predator was gone. They opened the Scaean gates and poured out like water breaking from a shattered dam. Leading them was Hector. We need to pause and truly talk about Hector. In pop culture, he is often portrayed purely as the good guy, the noble family man defending his home. And while that is true, Homer's text explains a different, ruthless side of him during these desperate days. Without Achilles to check him, Hector became an unstoppable juggernaut. He wasn't just defending, he was hunting. He drove the Greeks back across the plain, mile by bloody mile, forcing them into a humiliating retreat toward their beached ships. The situation grew so desperate that the Greeks were forced to do something unprecedented in the entire war. They stopped attacking and started building. They hastily constructed a massive defensive wall and a deep trench around their own fleet. Think about the profound humiliation. The invaders who came to lay siege to a city were now themselves besieged, trapped on the narrow edge of the ocean. Inside the camp of the Myrmidons, the atmosphere was suffocating. Imagine being a member of the world's most elite special forces unit, listening to your allies being slaughtered mere hundreds of yards away, and being ordered only to polish your shield. Achilles sat in his tent, calmly playing a lyre, singing songs of old glory while the thick smell of burning Greek corpses wafted in on the sea breeze. Though he thought this was the height of his prideful strike, it was a cold, calculated political maneuver. He was deliberately allowing his fellow soldiers, men he had eaten and sailed with, to die, just to prove to Agamemnon that he was utterly indispensable. It was passive aggression on a genocidal scale. The inevitable turning point came when the Trojan advance became unstoppable. Hector smashed through the Greek fortifications with a massive stone, shattering the gates. The Trojans flooded the camp. Torch in hand, Hector lunged straight for the ships. This was the ultimate nightmare scenario. If the ships burned, the Greeks had no way home. They would be trapped in hostile territory, destined for slavery or execution. The smoke billowed black into the sky, terrifyingly visible even from the Myrmidon camp. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, could take it no longer. He watched the agonizing destruction of the army and simply wept. He begged Achilles, "If you won't fight, at least let me. Let me wear your armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons. If the Trojans see your helmet, they will think you have returned, and they will run." Achilles looked at the fire consuming the ships. His blinding pride still wouldn't allow him to fight, but his ferocious possessiveness over his legacy permitted a compromise. He agreed to let Patroclus play the part. He gave Patroclus his distinctive armor, that terrifying bronze casing that every man knew. He gave him the Myrmidons. But he gave him one strict, terrible order, a command that would seal both their fates. Drive them from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Do not rob me of my glory. It was a warning rooted in selfishness, yet thinly disguised as concern. Patroclus donned the armor. He strapped on the greaves, laced up the massive breastplate, and secured the helmet with the towering horsehair crest. But there was one critical piece he could not take, the Pelian ash. The massive spear of Achilles remained firmly in the rack. Patroclus simply wasn't strong enough to lift it. He took a lesser spear, rallied the disciplined men, and charged out of the camp. The effect on the battlefield was instantaneous and electric. The Trojans, seeing the unmistakable silhouette of their nightmare, erupted in sheer panic. They thought the Reaper had returned. They broke rank and fled headlong. Patroclus, intoxicated by the sudden rush of power and the adrenaline of leading the most lethal unit in the world, tragically forgot the warning. He didn't stop at the burning ships. He chased the fleeing Trojans across the plain, slaughtering them by the dozen, driving them right back to the shadow of the great walls. He was winning. He was a god of war, until he wasn't. In the dust and chaos beneath the walls, he pushed fatally too far. He encountered a force he couldn't handle. Apollo, the god who favored Troy, struck him from behind, violently knocking the borrowed helmet from his head. The deception was over. Everyone saw it wasn't Achilles. Then came Euphorbus, a young Trojan who stabbed him in the back, and finally Hector. Hector finished the job with a lethal spear thrust to the belly. As Patroclus lay dying in the dirt, struggling for his last gasping words, he warned Hector that his victory was hollow and that death was already standing directly behind him. But the single most dangerous moment wasn't the death itself. It was the message. A runner immediately took off from the battlefield, sprinting toward the tent where Achilles waited, carrying the news that would shatter the world. The strike was over. The slaughter was about to begin. When Antilochus delivered the devastating news, "Patroclus is dead," Achilles did not immediately explode into rage. Instead, he collapsed. The Iliad describes a scene of primal, unadulterated devastation. The strongest man alive fell heavily to the ground, clawing desperately at the earth with his hands. He poured black dust over his famous golden hair and defiled his face with filth. He lay there like a massive, fallen statue, occupying so much space that the text describes him as mighty in his mightiness, sprawling in the dust. This wasn't merely sadness, it was a total psychological amputation. Patroclus and Achilles were not just comrades. They were, mythologically speaking, two halves of one soul. With Patroclus gone, the human half of Achilles died forever. But grief in the Bronze Age was volatile and dangerous. While Achilles wept in the dirt, the Trojans were still savagely fighting over Patroclus's body. They intended to drag it back to Troy, cut off the head, and mount it on a spike. Hector had already stripped the corpse bare. He was now wearing Achilles' own armor, the divine bronze gifted by the gods to his father. Think about the profound horror of that situation. To fight Hector now, Achilles would have to strike at his own silhouette. He would have to stab through his own breastplate. But he had a critical problem. He was completely unarmed. He had no armor, no spear, and no shield. He was naked to the enemy. But his wrath was now so potently divine that he didn't need steel. He rose from the dust and walked deliberately to the edge of the Greek trench. He didn't cross it. He just stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun. Homer tells us that the goddess Athena draped a shimmering golden cloud around his head and ignited it so that terrifying flames seemed to pour from his scalp. And then, he screamed. He didn't shout a battle command. He didn't call for a rally. He released an inarticulate, animalistic roar, a true war cry. It was a sound so fundamentally terrifying, so unnatural, that chaos instantly erupted in the Trojan ranks. Charioteers lost control of their horses. Soldiers turned and trampled each other in their panic. In the sheer, blind terror caused by the sound of his voice alone, 12 Trojan soldiers died, impaled on their own spears or crushed beneath their own chariots. He hadn't lifted a single finger. He had simply announced his return to the battlefield. The terrified Trojans immediately abandoned the corpse of Patroclus and fled frantically back behind their impregnable walls. The setting sun brought an official end to the fighting, but the subsequent night was sleepless for everyone, a vigil marked by dread and sorrow. Back in his tent, Achilles surrendered fully to his pain. He refused to wash the blood and dust from his skin, he refused to eat, he refused to sleep. He swore a terrible oath that he would not bury Patroclus until he had personally brought back the severed head of Hector and the heads of 12 noble Trojan youths. The beast within him was fully awakened and ravenous, but first he needed a new skin of war. Thetis, weeping for her son's fate, went to the only being capable of forging war gear that could withstand the fury of a demigod, Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. What Hephaestus created that night was far more than a tool for defense. It was a masterpiece of sublime, tragic irony. The shield of Achilles is famous in literature, yet its profound meaning is often overlooked. Across its surface, the god hammered out a detailed panorama of the entire mortal world. He depicted the vibrant earth, the soaring sky, and the restless sea. He forged 2 distinct cities of men, one celebrating peace, filled with weddings, dancing, and solemn law courts, and another consumed by war, rife with sudden ambushes and brutal strife. He showed lush fields of freshly plowed earth, vineyards heavy with ripe grapes, and young people singing joyfully. He placed the entire beautiful, attainable world that Achilles was actively rejecting onto the surface of the shield. When Achilles received the armor the next morning, the other Myrmidons were terrified even to look upon it. The sheer sheen of the divine metal was too bright, too painful for mortal eyes. Only Achilles could stare without flinching. The poet records that his eyes flared like twin blowtorches. He strapped on the greaves and fitted the breastplate. Finally, he picked up the shield, the vast image of the life he was explicitly rejecting: marriage, harvest, peace. He was carrying the world he could never possess upon his arm. He then moved to the stables and yoked his immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius. In a moment of supernatural dread, the goddess Hera granted the horse Xanthus the power of speech. The animal turned its head and delivered a stark warning. "We will save you today, mighty Achilles, but know this, your own day of death is near." Achilles did not even blink. He answered the horse with chilling, absolute fury. "Why do you prophesy my death? Fool, I know it well. I know I am destined to die here, far from my father and mother, but I will not stop until I have given the Trojans their absolute fill of blood." He mounted the chariot. He was no longer a soldier. He was a force of nature, a dead man walking, desperately seeking company for the grave. The slaughter that was about to unfold would render the previous 9 years of war little more than a skirmish. The river was waiting. Achilles ripped the Trojan army in half. He drove one panic-stricken group toward the relative safety of the city walls, but the other half, thousands of screaming, desperate men, he deliberately herded into the deep, swirling waters of the river Scamander. What followed was not a battle, it was an industrial liquidation. Achilles leaped into the water armed only with his sword. The Iliad describes the scene with gruesome, appalling clarity. The river turned crimson almost instantly. The sickening sounds of screaming men and splashing water echoed deafeningly off the canyon walls. He moved through the current like a thresher shark in a bait ball, hacking savagely at anything that moved. There was no strategy here, only the mechanical, relentless repetition of slaughter. In the middle of this carnage, a young Trojan prince named Lycaon crawled out of the bloody mud and desperately grabbed Achilles' knees. He begged for his life, he offered a massive ransom. In any other phase of the war, a Greek hero would have accepted the gold and the prisoner. But Achilles was no longer operating on the logic of commerce or honor. He looked down at the terrified boy and delivered one of the most chilling speeches in literary history. "Come, friend, you too must die. Why moan about it so? Even Patroclus died, a far, far better man than you. And look, you see how handsome and powerful I am. Even I have death waiting for me. There will be a dawn or a sunset or a noon when someone will take my life in battle. So die." He did not kill Lycaon out of anger or calculation, he killed him out of a shared, a nihilistic camaraderie. He slashed the boy's neck and contemptuously threw his body into the current for the fish to eat. But the slaughter was too efficient. The sheer, overwhelming volume of corpses clogged the channels so thoroughly that the river stopped flowing. This brings us to the most surreal moment in the entire history of the Greek mythological canon. The river itself awoke. In the ancient mind, the landscape was alive. The river god Scamander, choked by the blood and the bodies blocking his flow, rose up in human form to confront the killer. He roared at Achilles to stop filling his beautiful, clear channels with dead meat. Achilles, arrogant and completely blood-drunk, told the god to get out of his way. The river attacked. A massive wave, dark with gore and debris, rose up like a fist and crashed down on the hero. This was not a metaphor. Homer describes a brutal, physical wrestling match between a man and a primordial force of nature. The churning currents battered Achilles, dragging him under and stripping the ground from beneath his feet. The water beat violently against his shield, desperately trying to drown the divine fire that burned inside him. For the first time, Achilles was truly afraid. He didn't fear Hector, nor did he fear swords. He feared an ignoble death, drowning like a swineherd in a muddy ditch, erased by water without glory or witness. He screamed to the heavens, blaming his mother for deceiving him, begging not to die wet and obscure. The gods intervened immediately. Hera sent Hephaestus to save him. The smith god turned his flamethrowers on the river. It was elemental warfare, fire against water. The plains of Troy caught fire, the elms and willows lining the banks incinerated, the water boiled violently. The river god, scolded and steaming, finally surrendered. Achilles climbed out of the boiling mud. He was scorched, steamed, and covered in blood, but he was alive. And now, there was nothing standing between him and the walls of Troy. The river had failed to stop him. The army had failed to stop him. Only one man remained outside the gates, Hector. Hector stood alone. His parents, Priam and Hecuba, screamed down from the ramparts, tearing at their hair, begging him to come inside. They saw what was approaching across the plain. It was no longer a man, it was a calamity wrapped in divine armor, shining like the star Sirius, the star of disaster and scorching heat. But Hector did not move. His crippling pride pinned him to the spot. He had led the Trojans to disaster the previous day, and he could not face the profound shame of retreating now. He chose to stand his ground. Achilles closed the distance. The wind howled. The stage was set for the final duel of the Bronze Age. This is the moment Hollywood always gets wrong. In the movies, Achilles versus Hector is portrayed as a stoic, honorable duel between two master swordsmen. In the Iliad, it is a terrifying hunt. When Achilles charged, the greatest defender of Troy, did not brace his shield. He broke. Panic seized Hector's limbs. The sheer, radiating aura of violence emanating from Achilles was too much for the human mind to withstand. Hector turned and ran. This is not a critique of his bravery. It is a testament to Achilles' sheer monstrosity. They ran around the massive walls of Troy 3 times. Imagine the humiliation. The king of Troy, the queen, and all the terrified citizens watched from the ramparts as their savior sprinted for his life like a frightened deer, pursued by a nightmare clad in divine armor. Achilles chased him in silence, forbidding his men to fire arrows. He signaled with a shake of his head. "He is mine! No one touches him but me!" Hector only stopped because he was tricked. The goddess Athena, determined to end the war, disguised herself as Hector's most trusted brother. She appeared beside him, seemingly breathless, promising to stand and fight by his side. Emboldened by this false, divine hope, Hector finally turned to face his relentless pursuer. He attempted to negotiate, offering a pact. "If I kill you, I will strip your armor, but I will return your body to the Greeks. Promise me you will do the same." Achilles looked at him with dead, unblinking eyes. His response is the definition of hatred incarnate. "Do not talk to me of pacts, you man. There are no treaties between men and lions. There are no pacts between wolves and lambs. One of us will glut the god of war with his blood." The fight was brutally short. Hector threw his spear. It glanced harmlessly off Hephaestus's shield. He turned quickly to his brother for a spare, but the brother was gone. The illusion vanished. Hector realized in a cold wash of horror that the gods had finally abandoned him. He drew his sword for one final, desperate charge. Achilles knew the armor Hector was wearing. It was his own old armor, stripped from Patroclus. He knew its weak points perfectly. As Hector charged, Achilles drove his massive ash spear into the small gap at the collarbone, right through the tender flesh of the neck. Hector fell, but he didn't die instantly. He lay in the dust, gasping, begging once more for his body to be returned to his heartbroken parents. Achilles stood over him and whispered, "I only wish I had the stomach to hack your meat off and eat it raw for what you've done." Hector died, his final breath predicting Achilles' own impending death at the hands of Paris and Apollo. Achilles pulled his spear out and simply stated, "Die. I will accept my own death whenever Zeus wills it." Then began the horrific desecration. Killing Hector was not enough. The sheer force of Achilles' rage demanded more. Achilles stripped the body. Then, in front of Hector's screaming parents on the city wall, he took a knife and slit the tendons behind Hector's ankles. Between the heel and the bone, he threaded thick leather straps through the holes and tied the corpse to the back of his chariot. He whipped the horses. The chariot lurched forward. The noble head of the Prince of Troy, once accustomed to soft pillows, slammed into the hard earth. Achilles dragged him all the way back to the Greek ships. He did not stop there. For 12 consecutive mornings, Achilles woke up, tied the body to his chariot, and dragged it 3 times around the tomb of Patroclus. He wanted to physically erase Hector. He wanted to grind the man into paste. Apollo, taking pity on the dead prince, used his divine power to wrap the body in a golden shield of protection, preventing the skin from ripping and the dogs from consuming it. But the intent remained monstrous. This was the nadir of Achilles' soul. He had conquered Troy's greatest warrior, but in doing so, he had become something far less than human. He was a creature of pure, trapped hate, caught in a cycle of grief that no amount of blood could possibly wash away. The Greeks watched in uncomfortable, damning silence. This was no longer war, it was madness. For 12 days, Achilles existed in a fugue state of mechanized violence. But the gods had seen enough. Zeus sent a stern message: the body must be returned. Across the lines, King Priam of Troy prepared for what he knew was a suicide mission. He loaded a wagon with gold, fine fabrics, and cauldrons, a ransom fit for a prince. Then, under the cover of darkness and guided by the god Hermes, the frail old man drove straight into the heart of the Greek camp. He bypassed the sentries. He bypassed the trench where the massacre had taken place. He walked right up to the door of the lodge where the man who had murdered his sons sat eating his dinner. Priam entered alone. The Myrmidons froze, staring at this old king, who appeared like a ghost in the torchlight. Before Achilles could even reach for a weapon, Priam did the unthinkable. He dropped to his knees. He reached out and grasped the hands of Achilles, the very hands that had slaughtered so many of his children, and he kissed them. This shocking gesture shattered the entire universe of the Iliad. In a war defined by pride, honor, and fierce retaliation, absolute humility was the only remaining weapon. Priam did not ask for mercy, he asked for empathy. He looked up at the killer and said, "Think of your father, O Achilles. He is old like me. He waits for you at home, hoping to see you return. But I am unparalleled in misery. I have 50 sons, and you have killed the best of them. I have done what no other man on earth has dared. I have pressed my lips to the hand of the man who killed my son." The mention of his father, Peleus, struck Achilles harder than any spear. He realized suddenly that he would never see his father again. He realized that Peleus would soon be just like Priam, a grieving old man waiting for a son who would never come home. The rage, the cold menace, finally cracked. Achilles took the old king's hand and gently pushed him away, not in anger, but in shared sorrow. The two enemies sat in the tent and wept together. Priam wept openly for Hector. Achilles wept for his father and for Patroclus. The sound of their shared grief filled the room. For a brief, suspended moment, the war stopped. There were no Greeks or Trojans, only two broken men confronting the universal cruelty of mortality. Achilles stood up. He ordered his serving women to wash and anoint Hector's body thoroughly. He wanted to make absolutely certain that Priam did not see the horrific carnage inflicted on the corpse, fearing the old man's anger might flare up and force Achilles to violate the sacred laws of hospitality by killing him. Then he lifted Hector's body onto the wagon himself. Next, he did something even more surprising. He invited Priam to eat. They shared a solemn meal of bread and meat, acknowledging that life must continue even in the devastating face of death. Achilles promised a truce. He asked Priam how many days he needed to properly bury Hector. Priam requested 11 days of mourning, with the burial on the 10th and a feast on the 11th. On the 12th day, they would fight again. Achilles agreed completely. "I will hold back the Argive army for as long as you require." He grasped Priam's right wrist to reassure him, confirming the solemn oath. The old king slept soundly in the enemy camp that night, safe under the protection of his son's murderer. When Priam rode back to Troy at dawn with Hector's body, the cycle of rage had been suspended. Achilles had temporarily reclaimed his humanity. He was no longer a beast or a god. He was a man again, capable of profound pity. But as he watched the wagon disappear toward the city, he knew the clock was ticking. The truce would end. The war would resume, and his own time was rapidly running out. The truce held for 11 days. The smoke from Hector's massive funeral pyre faded slowly into the Aegean sky. Then, on the 12th morning, the drums beat and the meat grinder turned back on. Achilles returned to the field, but he was fundamentally different now. The white-hot rage had cooled into a cold, grim determination. He knew he was living on borrowed time. The prophecy was specific. He would die shortly after Hector. Every step he took toward the walls of Troy was a step toward his own waiting grave. He didn't fight mere local conscripts anymore. In the final, brief phase of his life, he fought legends. He struck down Penthesilea, the fierce queen of the Amazons. He slaughtered Memnon, the warrior king of Ethiopia who had arrived to save Troy. He was systematically clearing the board, removing every obstacle between the Greeks and the city. Finally, he did what no Greek had ever achieved. He breached the Scaean gates. He was inside the city. This was the moment of absolute, complete victory. If he kept going, he would sack Troy single-handedly. But the gods have boundaries, and Achilles had crossed them all. Apollo, the protector of the city, stood atop the walls. He had warned Achilles once before, and he would not warn him again. Crouched in the shadows of the gate tower was Paris. History loves irony. Paris was the absolute antithesis of Achilles. He was a lover, not a fighter. He preferred perfume to blood. Crucially, he fought with a bow, a weapon that, in the elite code of the Bronze Age, was viewed with disdain. It was the weapon of the coward who dared not look his enemy in the eye. But a bow can kill a demigod if the aim is true. Paris drew the string taut. He didn't aim with skill, he aimed with raw desperation. But he didn't need skill. Apollo, invisible to the mortals below, reached down and guided the flight of the arrow. It didn't strike Achilles in the heart or the head. It struck him in the heel. Whether you believe the myth of the river Styx, where his heel was his only dry, vulnerable spot, or the simple medical reality, the result was the same. A severed Achilles tendon cripples a man instantly. You cannot stand. You cannot charge. The greatest runner in the Greek army, the man they called swift-footed Achilles, was suddenly and permanently anchored to the earth. He fell. The physical pain would have been blinding, but the psychological shock was worse. He wasn't dying in a glorious duel with a worthy equal. He was being picked off from a distance by the very man who had started this entire mess, a man he considered beneath contempt. Paris fired again and again. Achilles crashed into the dust of the city he had almost conquered. The sheer anticlimax of it stunned the entire battlefield. The invincible warlord was just meat, after all. The fight for his corpse was more vicious than the fight for the city itself. Odysseus and the giant Ajax fought back to back, holding off the entire Trojan army to retrieve the body. They refused to let the Trojans do to Achilles what Achilles had done to Hector. Ajax carried the massive body of his cousin back to the ships while Odysseus held off the relentless attackers. They brought him back to the camp, but the silence was deafening. The ultimate weapon was broken. The funeral of Achilles dwarfed even Patroclus's. The Muses themselves came down to sing the mournful dirge. His mother, Thetis, rose from the sea with her sisters, their wailing echoing across the water. They built a pyre that lit up the Dardanelles. They mixed his ashes with those of Patroclus in a single golden urn. Finally, in death, the two were reunited, their bones mingling in the same vessel, buried under a great mound on the headland that could be seen by sailors for centuries to come. He had achieved his goal. He had traded a long life for eternal glory. He had his Cleos. But as the flames died down and the Greeks looked at the pile of ash that used to be a demigod, a haunting question remained: was it truly worth it? The answer wouldn't come from the living. It would come from the dead. Because the story of Achilles doesn't end in the dirt of Troy. It ends in the darkness of the underworld with a final confession that changes everything we think we know about heroism. The story of the Trojan War usually concludes with the fall of the city, but the story of Achilles has an epilogue hidden in a completely different book. Years after the war, Odysseus, the man who dragged Achilles out of hiding on Skyros, travels to the underworld in Homer's Odyssey. He performs a dark ritual to speak with the dead. Among the drifting shadows, he spots the spectral ghost of Achilles. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, attempts to comfort his old friend. He tells Achilles, "Do not grieve at your death. When you were alive, we honored you like a god. And now that you are here, you are a mighty prince among the dead. You have your glory. You have your Cleos." Achilles' reply shatters the entire warrior code of the Bronze Age in a single line. He looks at Odysseus with infinite, chilling regret and delivers the most important line in Greek mythology. "Do not speak soothingly to me of death, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be a paid laborer to a poor man on earth, a slave to a peasant with no land, than be the king of all these breathless dead." Think about the weight of that admission. For his entire short life, Achilles sacrificed absolutely everything for fame. He gave up marriage. He gave up fatherhood. He gave up peace. And he gave up old age. All for the promise that his name would be remembered forever. He treated his mortal life as a mere currency to buy immortality. But now, standing on the other side, he realizes the profound scam. Being a legend is cold comfort when you don't have a body to feel the warmth of the sun. He would trade all the statues, all the poems, and all the glory just to be a nobody sweating in a field, breathing fresh air for one more day. This is the brutal truth about Achilles. He isn't a hero to be emulated, he is a dire warning. We live in a world that is obsessed with legacy. We are told to grind, to hustle, to sacrifice our health and our relationships to make a dent in the universe. We look at billionaires and celebrities the way the Greeks looked at Achilles, as people who have transcended the ordinary. But the ghost in the underworld tells us we are devastatingly wrong. The rage that drove him didn't liberate him, it consumed him. The glory he bought with blood was a hollow trophy. In the end, the simple, elemental act of living, of eating bread with a friend, of feeling the rain, of holding a hand, is worth infinitely more than all the honor in the world. Achilles was the greatest killer who ever lived, but his final lesson is a celebration of life itself. He arrived in the world as a singular force, a weapon forged of bronze and fire. Yet, in the final, agonizing moments of his short life, he discovered the profound beauty of being truly human, a realization that arrived far too late for him to truly savor it. Don't make the same tragic mistake Achilles did. If you appreciated this deep dive into the archives of Greek mythology, and are eager to explore ancient history stripped of the modern Hollywood filter, ensure you subscribe right now and turn on those notifications. Coming up next, I have an essential video detailing the cunning, and sometimes calculated madness, of Odysseus, a deep dive you absolutely will not want to miss. Before you go, let me pose one final, ancient dilemma in the comments below. If you were given the choice between the fate of Achilles, a short, glorious life remembered forever, or a long, quiet existence entirely forgotten by history, which path would you choose? Thank you for tuning in.